Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to another video. My name is Dylan and I'm a cycling coach here at Carmichael Training Systems in Brevard, North Carolina. Today we're going to be talking about functional threshold power. First, I'll go into what FTP is and why it's important, and then I'll discuss 5 ways you can determine your FTP using a power meter. So for many of us, it's getting to be that time of year where we need to start thinking about focus on the bike training, and that means that an FTP test is on the horizon. Knowing your threshold is imperative if you want to train with zones, because pretty much every zone model out there is based off of FTP. Before we talk about how to determine your FTP, let's go into a little bit about what FTP actually is. When we exercise, our bodies produce lactate, and this lactate is cleared by the liver and muscles. At a certain intensity, your body will start to produce lactate faster than it can clear it. And if you stay at this intensity, this lactate will start to accumulate. Fatigue is inevitable after this point, and before long, you'll be forced to reduce your intensity. This is called the lactate threshold. In cycling, we measure our power at lactate threshold, and this power number is known as functional threshold power, or FTP. It's generally defined as the power you can hold for 1 hour in well-trained cyclists, but this may vary person to person. There are a number of ways to test your FTP, all of which come with positives and negatives. Not every method will work best for every person, depending on what kind of athlete you are and what kind of roads you have access to for testing. So since FTP is defined as the highest power you can sustain for 1 hour, then perhaps the most obvious test is to just go out and ride as hard as you can for an hour, and then see what the average power is. The upside of this test is that it's probably the most accurate short of getting your lactate threshold tested in a lab. That is, if you have the mental fortitude to sustain this test. And that's the biggest downside with this method of testing. It can be extremely challenging to hold your FTP for 1 hour if you're not motivated by a race situation. If you have the opportunity to do an hour-long time trial, then this is a great way to do a 60-minute test because you'll be highly motivated by the racing atmosphere. However, keep in mind that your FTP in the aero position will likely be lower than it is in your regular position, especially if you're not used to it. Another downside of this test is finding a road that's uninterrupted for 60 minutes. Preferably you want a road that's flat with very little undulation and no interruptions, or a steady climb. But keep in mind that if you're climbing for 60 minutes, you'll likely be getting into some higher altitudes, and that will decrease the power you can produce at the end of the test. Of course, you could do this test on the trainer if you really want to torture yourself. At least then you wouldn't have to deal with finding a suitable road. Keep in mind though that most people's power on the trainer is lower than it is on the road, and that you want to do it in a cool place with fans on you because you'll be producing a lot of heat. Probably the most common method for determining one's FTP is the 20-minute test. For this test, you want to get in a solid warm-up and then ride steady as hard as you can for 20 minutes. And then you take that average power for 20 minutes and multiply it by 0.95 to get what you could theoretically hold for 1 hour. Pros for this method of testing are that it's easier mentally to do a 20-minute test than an hour-long test, and it's certainly easier to find a 20-minute section of road than it is an hour-long section. It's also less physically taxing, which means you'll be able to recover from this test quicker than the hour. Cons for this method of testing are that it's less accurate, especially in more anaerobic athletes. If you're more of the punchy sprinter type, then you may actually have to take an even lower percentage of your 20-minute to get your FTP, like 90 or 85% in some athletes. The 2x8 minute test is Carmichael's testing protocol and was designed to be even less mentally taxing than the 20-minute. With this test, you warm up and then you do 2 8-minute max efforts with 10 to 15 minutes between each. You then take the average of those 8-minute efforts and take 90% of that to find your FTP. The big pro with this test is that it's easier mentally than the 20-minute and certainly the hour. It's also easier to find an 8-minute section of uninterrupted road. If you live in a city, this may be the best option. The con of this method is that it's probably the least accurate. Anaerobic athletes will have a huge advantage in such a short test, and 90% probably won't truly represent their FTP. With this next method, you don't actually have to do a test, which can be very appealing. Instead, you want to do a hard 1 hour effort, such as a crit or a group ride. A group ride would probably work better because the goal here is to produce the highest normalized power that you can for the hour. And sometimes in a race situation like a crit, you might want to conserve energy until the right moment, unless you're just using that race for training or testing purposes. Normalized power tries to take into account the physiological toll of a ride by giving you a number that's supposed to represent how hard that ride would have been had you ridden at a consistent pace. So in theory, your normalized power for a hard 1 hour group ride or race should be equal to your FTP. Pros for this method is that no test is required, so using this method is probably the easiest mentally. Cons for this method are that just like the other testing methods other than the 60-minute, it favors the anaerobic athlete. The punchier athlete will be able to hit higher power peaks and therefore skew their normalized power to be higher than what their true FTP value probably is. You also need access to a very hard 1 hour group ride or race, which not everybody has in their local area at all times of the year. The last test is the newest method for finding FTP and is gaining traction as a superior way to find FTP over more traditional options like the 20-minute test. Now there are many protocols for a graded test, but essentially instead of holding one power output for the full test like in a 60, 20-minute or 2x8, you want to slowly increase your intensity. The idea behind a graded test is to get closer to the physiological demands of FTP without having to do a 60-minute test. So what does a graded test look like? Well, like I said, there are a bunch of different methods, and since this is relatively new territory for FTP testing, coaches and athletes are still determining what the best method is. One example of a graded test might be to start at tempo and increase your intensity every 3 to 5 minutes for about 20 minutes until you are around what you predict your FTP to be, and ride all out for 20 minutes after that. There are also methods that have you start under your predicted FTP and end over your predicted FTP. An example of this might be starting off riding for 10 minutes at 95% of your FTP, then hold your predicted FTP for 20 minutes, and then do a 5-minute all-out effort to finish it off. For a test like this, the average power for the whole test would be close to your FTP. Trainer Road has a graded test where intensity is increased every minute until exhaustion, and then a new FTP number is given to you. Pros for a graded test are that most athletes find them mentally easier since you aren't going all out the whole time. This also means there's less of a physiological toll, meaning that you can recover faster from this sort of test. Cons are that there's a lot of graded testing protocols out there using different combinations of intensity and duration, and it can be difficult to determine which one is most accurate. You also need a long stretch of uninterrupted road if you're not using a trainer, because these tests can last 30 minutes to over an hour. For each one of these tests, you want to treat it as if it's a race. That means being well-fed, well-rested, and mentally prepared. You don't want to overthink it though. Many cyclists get stressed out before an FTP test. Remember, this is just a training tool, and your FTP number doesn't define you as an athlete. What's your preferred method for finding your FTP? Leave it in the comment section below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to know how to test their FTP. Subscribe to this channel for more coaching content and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Interested in getting a coach? Shoot me an email at djohnson@trainright.com.